Tonight's session with the Air Force Foundation Book Club. I'm Pepe Soto. We'll be talking about Max Boot's book. So pull it out here. The Road Not Taken. A great book about the most famous intel officer you've never heard of, Edward Lansdale. And we'll start now with the president of the Air Force Corps Foundation, Ms. Jonna Doolittle. Boo, over to you.
First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and a special thanks to Matt Boot for the wonderful book and for agreeing to join us. And on a personal note, I want to thank Pepe for bringing us the book club and all of the stuff that he does for the foundation behind the scenes. I have a special favor to ask of those of you who've joined us. We have a project called the 9/12 Project, which is the U.S. involvement in the Middle East, starting out on 9/12 and going through our withdrawal. This is a project that's particularly close to General Holmes' heart. And so any of you who are willing to, I would greatly appreciate you helping out there. An update of things we've done this year. War Stories, which meets every other month and is based on the same Zoom meetings as Book Club, has done really, really well. And we appreciate that. We have two significant partnerships with Air University. One is with Air University Press, and it's a digital imprint that we will share with them. And it's this year, we are working on reprinting and expanding Pete Kopp's book, A Few Great Captains, which is probably one of the most important volumes that discuss what went on with the Army Air Corps, Army Air Force prior to World War II and the hurdles that they had to jump. Our target date for publication on that one is going to be late spring of 2024. The other partnership we have with AU is with the Library Archives Division. And we have three incredible projects going with them. One is never published before photographs or images taken by foundation members. The second is going to be an access portal on the Intake magazine, which is the journal of the Super Saber Society. And probably the biggest project with them is we are joining with them to digitize and catalog approximately 250,000 images that are currently held by Air Force Association Magazine's archives. We're considering moving the Arnold project over there and also to start an archive on the Doolittle projects. And the last thing I'll talk about is in September, on the 15th through the 19th in Denver, we are holding our symposium. This year it is going to be at the Denver Hyatt High-Tech Center and Wings Over the Rockies. Our registration form is on the web page, as are tickets. And this is going to have three levels to it. It will be veterans who will talk about Vietnam. It will be museum partners in kind of a takeoff joint program with Smithsonian on mutual concerns. And the third is going to be our historians and scholars. So we'd love to see you there. And in the meantime, I will turn it back to Pepe and again to Max. Thank you.
Thanks, Boo. First of all, I want to introduce to you Max Boot. Max is an author, but basically a military historian also. Very much tied in with some of our great leaders here, with General Patrice leaders in the last 10 to 15 years on the global war on terrorism. He's worked with Christian Science Monitor and Wall Street Journal. He's now on the Gene Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow at the National Security Studies at the Council for Foreign Relations. And he's seen in the Washington Post also. He's written 4 or 5 great books on guerrilla warfare, military affairs, just a great author. But this book really caught me because as an intel officer, never heard about Edward Lansdale, so I read this book and I feel bad about that. So without further ado, Max, sir, over to you, and thank you for being here tonight with us. Sir, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Okay, thanks for inviting me, Pepe, and thanks to everybody for coming out and giving me another chance to talk about one of my favorite people, Ed Lansdale. And I say he's one of my favorite people, even though I never actually got to meet him, because he died, many years before I started working on this book, which came out in 2018. But I felt like I got to know Ed Lansdale. In fact, I had, towards the end of my research, I visited his grave at Arlington National Cemetery, and I kind of felt like, wow, I know more about this guy than I do about my own parents. In fact, more about him than his own kids know about him in many ways, because he was such a complicated, multi-layered guy who did not reveal all of himself to most of the people that he knew, including his own family members. But he was truly one of the legendary and forgotten figures in the Air Force, and one of the more unconventional, kind of off-the-wall general officers, I would say, that the Air Force or pretty much any other service has ever had. Since he was, he had, his training was pretty much on the job. He was certainly not a qualified pilot or navigator or bombardier or anything like that. He couldn't operate any weapon system bigger than a 45 caliber pistol. He wasn't even a qualified public affairs officer or intelligence officer. He was kind of his own thing. He was kind of sui generis. He was originally somebody who was well, as we were talking with Pepe, because Pepe went to UCLA, and of course, Ed Lansdale went to UCLA, although never quite completed his schooling, dropping out during the Great Depression and going to get a job, hoping to become a cartoonist for the New Yorker in the 1930s, eventually made his way into advertising. And then when World War II broke out, he found a position for himself in the OSS and then in Army intelligence. But he was stateside during World War II. He was basically interviewing travelers to try to glean intelligence about various spots that Allied armies would be invading. In kind of a peculiar set of circumstances, just as the war was ending in 1945, he was actually shipped abroad for his very first foreign posting, which happened to be in the Philippines. And he arrived shortly after the end of hostilities in the Philippines, but dealing with a society that was, greatly disordered and traumatized by the war. I mean, as I'm sure a lot of you know, Manila was one of the cities that was most destroyed during World War II. And in the wake of this horrific war, there was a communist insurgency, the Hukbalahap rebellion, the Hooks as they were called for short. And there was a lot of turmoil and a lot of concern about what was going on in the Philippines. And Lansdale kind of plunged into this as an Army Public Affairs officer, initially intelligence officer, then Army Public Affairs officer. He kind of integrated himself very quickly into Philippine society and really became friends with a huge swath of Filipinos from different walks of life and really immersed himself in Philippine society. And he was helped in that by the friendship that he made with this extraordinary Filipino lady named Pat Kelly, who was a journalist when they met and became a great love of his life. He was at the time married to his first wife, whom he had met in New York. But he really fell in love with Pat Kelly. And one of the ways I was able to research this book in a way that nobody else has been able to do was that I had access not only to the letters that Ed wrote to his wife, but also to the letters that he wrote to his longtime mistress, Pat Kelly. And that really provide, and I was the first person to see both sets of letters, and they really provide this unparalleled vantage point onto his thinking. So he fell in love with the Philippines, he fell in love with Pat Kelly. Eventually, he transitioned from the Army to the Air Force because he had this notion that the Air Force as a new service was going to be more congenial to out-of-the-box thinking than the Army. So he became an Air Force officer and then eventually made his way into the civilian intelligence bureaucracy, working initially for something called the Office of Policy Coordination, which was one of the precursors to the CIA. Eventually, in the early 50s, it was folded into the CIA. But he basically, working for the Office of Policy Coordination, he got a chance to go back to the Philippines in the early 50s when it looked like, when of course this was in 1950, when it looked, this was after the Korean War had started, when it looked like there was this, after China had fallen to communism, so it seemed like there was this red wave sweeping all over the planet, and there was a lot of concern that the Philippines was going to go the same way, but nobody wanted to send a bunch of American troops to the Philippines because to fight this, the Hook Rebellion, because the U.S. was already committed in Korea. And so instead of sending a bunch of troops, the intelligence bureaucracy sent Ed Lansdale and a small team to try to wage political warfare to defeat this communist uprising. And shockingly enough, he did. He largely by befriending a fellow named Ramon Magsaysay, who was at the time defense minister of the Philippines, Philippine war hero, and Lansdale and Magsaysay became as close as brothers, and together they pioneered what we would today call population-centric counterinsurgency, basically teaching the Philippine army that they had to act towards the people with brotherly love. They had to stop coming into barrios and bombarding, villages indiscriminately, stealing from people. They had to gain the confidence of the people. And once they gained the confidence of the people through proper behavior, then the people would have trust in them and would, have sufficient trust in the troops to tell them who were the communist insurgents hiding in their midst. And that actually was a very successful model that eventually helped lead to the defeat of the Hook Rebellion. And so in 1953, Lansdale came home as a very secret war hero, or a very secret intelligence hero. Allen Dulles loved him, one of the first directors of the CIA. President Eisenhower loved him because they thought that he had delivered this amazing Cold War victory. And so as his reward, when this new state of South Vietnam was created in 1954 after the Geneva Accords, Ed Lansdale was sent to South Vietnam and basically told to do in South Vietnam, which he did in the Philippines. And he kind of did in a way, because just as he had defended Ramon Magsaysay in the Philippines, in Vietnam, he defended Ngo Dinh Diem, who was the first prime minister and then president of the Republic of South Vietnam. And, just as with Magsaysay, Lansdale had masterminded the defeat of the Hook Rebellion. So in South Vietnam, he helped Diem to consolidate his authority because he was facing a massive armed uprising by various sect militias who had many more weapons and troops than the nascent South Vietnamese army did. But Lansdale helped Diem to maneuver and kept the Eisenhower administration from dumping him as so many wanted to do. And basically by the mid-50s, Diem had consolidated his authority, and he was seen as kind of a champion of the free world in the battle against communism. And at the end of the 50s, Lansdale went home. He didn't really get along with the bureaucracy of the CIA, so he wound up at DOD, and he wound up basically as under sort of, assistant secretary, the deputy assistant secretary, and assistant secretary for what we would today call SOLIC, Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. It had a slightly different name at the time, but that was essentially what he did. And he helped in that position. He helped to bring into being the Navy SEALs, the Army Green Berets, and other special operations formations. But the whole time he was, of course, keeping a close eye on Vietnam, and he was anguished by what he was seeing as the relationship between the Kennedy administration and Diem spun out of control, leading eventually, of course, the decision by President Kennedy to back a military coup against Diem, which is something that Lansdale warned would be catastrophic, because he knew all these South Vietnamese military officers, and he knew that they did not have the capacity to run the country capably. And so he predicted the disorder and chaos that would happen if Diem were overthrown. And of course, that is exactly what happened. And it didn't take long before the virtual collapse of South Vietnam after the assassination of Diem and his brother. That led Lyndon Baines Johnson, of course, to decide that he had to send American combat troops to South Vietnam to save the situation. And Lansdale was, although he was very much in favor of helping South Vietnam, he was very much against Americanizing the war. He warned that, you know, you had to win the battle for hearts and minds, and by pouring in all these American troops, you were basically handing the banner of nationalism to the Vietnamese communists. And so he was, I think, very foresightful in warning about some of the dangers of the course that America was on. But at that point, he was not being listened to. And this was, you know, my book is you know, it's called The Road Not Taken, Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam. And this is part of the tragedy, is that, you know, Lansdale had some insights into South Vietnam, but he was utterly ignored by President Johnson, by General Westmoreland, by all the powers that be. And eventually in 1965, he came out to South Vietnam again as a special assistant to US Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge. But by that point, he was really sidelined because the war was being Americanized. It was all about heavy firepower and body counts and rack 'em and stack 'em. And he kept warning that that was not going to win, that it was essentially to defeat an insurgency. You had to win the battle of ideas. And that was something that was relegated to the sidelines. And he was very frustrated in his second tour in Vietnam. He stayed through 1968. He was there during the Tet Offensive, but he was increasingly powerless and marginalized as the war took this horrific, costly, and tragic turn. And eventually he went back to the States in 1968. A few years later, his first wife, Helen, died, and Pat Kelly came over from the Philippines, and they finally got married in 1972, I think it was. And so kind of lived happily ever after, except for the anguish that Lansdale felt in watching South Vietnam collapse, and so many of his old friends having to become refugees and flee the country. So it's a tremendously, I think, interesting as well as instructive story, because, you know, I think we've seen in recent years as well attempts to kind of defeat insurgencies through firepower, and it doesn't really work very well. And I think, you know, Lansdale wouldn't have necessarily been successful in Vietnam, but if his approach had been followed, even if he failed, it would have been at a much lower cost. It wouldn't have been with 58,000 Americans. And what he always preached was on essentially understanding and listening to the people that you were working with. He was, you know, a lot of people suggest that he was kind of caricatured by Graham Greene in his novel, The Quiet American. He was definitely the model for one of the characters in The Ugly American. But, you know, and so a lot of people, there was a lot of mystique and a lot of legends about Ed Lansdale, but, and, you know, he was often, people focused on some of the psychological warfare tricks that he played, and we can talk about those. But really, the essence of his method was basically listening to people that he was working with in developing countries, establishing a rapport with them, and trying to guide them very gently on the path that he thought was the right way to go, instead of lecturing them, giving them non-negotiable demands, or, you know, doing all the other things that we Americans like to do with our partners all over the world. So he was basically, you know, one of the things that I write in the book is that he basically figured out how to weaponize empathy and turn empathy into a powerful weapon of war by empathizing with folks in the Philippines and South Vietnam, understanding their problems and helping them to deal with them on a completely equal basis of friendship, which was pretty rare, certainly in those days, when, you know, there was so much racism in the United States about Asians in particular, and Lansdale had none of that. He just dealt with people, as his complete equals, and that's how he was able to establish a rapport and to be influential, at least for a while. So, you know, fascinating character who kind of ended his days in failure, but I think still has a lot to teach us. And certainly writing his story was an extraordinary experience for me over the course of roughly 8 years. So with that, let me stop talking at you and have more of a two-way conversation.
Thanks, Max. That was a great rundown of the book, and I guess I see why you actually were drawn to write about Ed Lansdale. Such a complex figure, but so much going on with his life and his career. But you talk about his career, you know, not being a pilot. I mean, pretty much was a non-standard Air Force career. To be a general officer back in the 60s and not be a pilot or rated is kind of almost unheard of. So you think it was more of him being at the right place at the right time, or was his skills that unique that put him in that position to take advantage of those opportunities?
I think it was a combination of things. He certainly had unique skills. He was seen by the Eisenhower administration and by the Kennedy administration in their early days. He was seen as kind of a water walker. He was, JFK, who loved the Ian Fleming novels, thought that Lansdale was the American James Bond. So there was like a mystique about him that he was somebody, who had this kind of, people thought had this kind of mystic mind meld with people in developing countries and could work miracles. Unfortunately, and that's essentially how he advanced in DOD and the Air Force. It was really outside of the Air Force bureaucracy, even though he was an Air Force general. He really advanced through the favor of Allen Dulles, CIA Director John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, President Eisenhower, and then the Kennedy brothers. Those were really his patrons. He was really outside of any kind of normal service bureaucracy, but it also came back to haunt him in the end because Robert McNamara was no fan of Ed Lansdale, and that was ultimately his undoing. That's what drove him out of the Air Force and kept him away from Vietnam because McNamara, was very numbers oriented, and of course, Harvard Business School graduate, former president of the Ford Motor Company. So he was very unimpressed by Ed Lansdale. And, when McNamara came in, he called Lansdale to his office one day and said, Ed, I'm trying to, reduce our task in Vietnam to a series of mathematical calculations. And he had one of those graph paper, and he was writing numbers and he was trying to get it all, into an arithmetic equation. And, Lansdale said, well, that's great, Mr. Secretary, but have you considered the X factor? And, McNamara said, oh, the X factor, what's that? I got to write X factor. And then Lansdale told him, you can't quantify it because the X factor is the feelings and sentiments of the people of Vietnam about how they want to be ruled. And that's ultimately going to be dispositive in this war, but you can't quantify it. You can't control it from the Pentagon, and you certainly can't, win the X factor with firepower. And so instead of taking that to heart, which was actually a fairly astute and wise observation, McNamara just concluded that Lansdale was a moron who wasn't on his intellectual level and kind of dismissed him and didn't get along with him at all. And so eventually, just to conclude the story, really Lansdale's downfall was Operation Mongoose, the interagency effort to topple Castro, launched in early 1962. And again, as I mentioned, the Kennedys loved Lansdale at that point. They thought he was the American James Bond. So they put him in charge of this crazy project that was supposed to topple Castro without the use of US troops and with hardly any, underground left in Cuba. There was really no insurgency in Cuba. And so, over the course of 1962, as Lansdale failed to topple Castro, which he wasn't going to do in the first place, he basically lost favor with his protectors, the Kennedy brothers. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Operation Mongoose was shut down, although the Kennedys continued with other projects with Castro, but Mongoose was shut down, and Lansdale was basically discarded, and he was left sort of vulnerable to McNamara and forced into retirement, basically right immediately before the coup against Diem, which sent South Vietnam spiraling downward. So it's kind of a case of, you can advance with political favor, but you can also lose your career when you fall out of favor.
So that is someone who starts their career as a marketing executive, which you research, which you talk about in your book, become an expert in developing counterinsurgency strategies and executing coin campaign. I mean, it seems like a huge leap from being a marketer on, New York City, all of a sudden here you are developing these strategies. I think his marketing background has something to do with that success, or how did it all work?
Yeah, no, I think he would have said that it did. He was in advertising, and as an ad man, primarily in San Francisco, he was trying to figure out how do you sell products to the public, the products that he was marketing. What's the appeal of the product to the consumer? And he basically applied the same mindset to the guerrilla wars in the Philippines and South Vietnam. His mindset was, well, how do you sell the government to the people? How do you make them, the government we support, to the alternative offered by the communist insurgents, right? And he decided it didn't come down to any kind of tricks, or there was nothing crazy about it. He decided that people would support the government if they thought that the government was basically honest, met a lot of their needs, and wasn't abusive or corrupt. So that was the message that he tried to sell to my side with a lot of success, and to CM with kind of more limited success. But it was, I mean, on its face, it sounds like really simple, but it's actually really hard to execute because, I think those of you who are familiar or have served in Iraq or Afghanistan know like how endemic corruption was in both of those societies, and how hard it was to root out how many abusive militias were on the side of the government, and how their abuses often backfired. Very similar issues in places like Vietnam and in the Philippines in the 50s. But Lansdale figured out how to work with the government to try to reduce its corruption and abusiveness so as to increase its attractiveness to the target audience, i.e. the population. So it's something that's very easy to say, but very, very hard to do in practice.
Yeah, say at NASA in the Air Force, we have information officers doing PSYOPs, but they're poli-sci majors, not marketing majors. So trying to make that pitch, we know people trained in that. And I took that away from your book as a note I want to give the A2 about maybe developing our PSYOP officers more around marketing backgrounds and poli-sci backgrounds. So I took that as a major note from your book.
That makes sense.
You really talked about it, and he really seemed to understand the people and politics of the country you worked in. More than we had seen in the past. Was that also key to success, studying the people and the backgrounds more than anybody else had? Because he seemed to understand the Filipinos and their culture, same with the Vietnamese, not just as a ally, but also as a people.
That's exactly right. And I think there's a tendency, which is kind of fomented by our kind of rotational personnel system, that you're constantly sending people like on 1-year tours, or even less than that. You have to kind of parachute into a new country, figure out what's going on. Kind of by the time you kind of know what's going on, you rotate out, the next unit comes in, and they start at zero again. So that old line about how we weren't in Vietnam for 10 years, we were there 1 year 10 times, and kind of the same thing in Iraq and Afghanistan. But Lansdale, because he was sort of outside of the normal bureaucracy, kind of had the luxury of more time. And, he spent almost a decade in the Philippines altogether. And he really, learned about Filipino society. He became immersed in the Philippines. And again, helped by the fact that his mistress and love of his life, Pat Kelly, was a Filipino who was also very well connected. So he talked to people on all sides, whether it was on the government side, on the book side, farmers, businessmen, politicians, anybody you could imagine. He actually became one of the best known Americans in the Philippines because he talked to so many different people. And that was understanding the local society is what really enabled him to come up with effective strategies to combat this insurgency that he wouldn't have been able to do if you were coming into some place where he'd never been. And it was a harder task for him in South Vietnam because he didn't have as long there. He also had more language barriers because, he was kind of a typical American in one respect, which was that he really only spoke English, which wasn't a huge problem in the Philippines, but it was more of an obstacle in Vietnam in the 50s when folks spoke either Vietnamese or French. By the 60s, of course, a lot of Vietnamese were speaking English, but in the 50s, it was a little bit of an obstacle. But even with the language barrier, he was still able to communicate very effectively. And again, really immersed himself in the complexities of Vietnamese society. And one of the things that he did so effectively, I would add, is he had this tremendous patience because, those of you who are familiar with No Dinh Diem know that he was a tremendous windbag, and he could easily go on for like 8 hours, giving these soliloquies about the arcana of Vietnamese politics. And, his average American interlocutor would be ready to kill himself after 30 minutes and would certainly not sit through a multi-hour lecture on like this province and this district chief and that and that and that and the other. But Lansdale actually would. He had like tremendous patience. He wouldn't even go to the bathroom. He would sit there and listen to CM go on and on and on. And he would actually try to understand what Zion was saying. And then generally he would try to introduce his own thought into the conversation by saying, oh, that's fascinating, Mr. President. If I understand what you're saying, what you're really saying is X, Y, and Z. And then he would basically rephrase what Zion was saying and injecting his own advice, but making Zion think that all he was doing was reflecting Zion's own thoughts back to him. And that was actually a kind of a tricky but very effective way of influencing somebody. So if there's one takeaway from the book, I'd say that's actually a great way to operate. And I would add, by the way, that's a great way to operate. Not only if you're a military advisor, it's a great way to operate with colleagues or subordinates or superiors at work. It's a great way to operate with your spouse. It's actually a strategy that works in pretty much any human relationship, I would say.
Awesome. So we got a question from the field. You want to take that, Pusha Jen? Jen?
I'm
Oh,
here.
no.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so our question is from Bingham. If you want to come up and ask it, otherwise I can go ahead and read it out. All right. I'll go ahead and
Okay, I'm on now.
perfect.
Reading about China and our losing China, and we had military officers and foreign service officers that knew Mao Zedong and others were much more effective than Chiang Kai-shek, and were recommending that we not get involved. Unfortunately, politics got involved in it, and we were supporting Chiang Kai-shek. I wonder if Lansdale had ever talked to or learned from foreign service officers that had been in China or in Yugoslavia. It seems like we got into a habit of trying to suppress nationalistic revolutions with American forces, which hasn't worked out at all.
Yeah, I would agree with you. There was not much overlap between what Lansdale was doing in Vietnam and the Philippines, and what was happening in China. Although we certainly learned from what was happening in China. I mean, he was one of the early Americans who actually read the work of Miles' works and his theories of how to promulgate a revolution. And what he was basically trying to do was kind of Maoism, reverse Maoism for liberal democracy. He was trying to apply some of Mao's methods of winning over the population, but use it against Maoist insurgents. But you're right. I think there's some parallels between what Lansdale was trying to do and the struggles that folks like Vinegar Joe Stilwell, I think, was the most celebrated case. Somebody who had spent a lot of time in China and understood China pretty well, but his advice, and of course he had a very low opinion of Chiang Kai-shek, whom he referred to as peanut. But ultimately, politics, as you suggested, kind of carried the day, and it's just, I mean, it's another whole set of circumstances. But basically, during World War II, FDR decided to build up free China, quote unquote, as being an equal partner of the United States, and to pretend that it was, carrying as much weight as Britain or other members of the coalition. And so that kind of, and of course, Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang had a huge following in the United States, where they were the darlings of right-wing Republicans. And so they had a huge constituency that FDR felt compelled to cater to. And anyway, long story short, Stilwell was finally recalled from China, and a lot of the foreign service officers who were there, who also had a very realistic appreciation of what was going on, they were ultimately pilloried as red agents and tools of communism, and driven out of the foreign service, and that made it very hard to tell the truth about China in the late 40s, early 50s. And as your question suggested, I think it was a huge lost opportunity, because I was recently looking at some of the writings and dispatches of some of the foreign service officers who were in China in the 1940s, and they were basically, saying, Mao is no great Democrat, but he's also not a Russian stooge. He actually aspires to be his own independent power center. And, you know, it kind of makes you wonder what would have happened if we had recognized that earlier than we did. I mean, it took until the 1970s for us to act on that insight. In the meantime, we had the Korean War, we had the Vietnam War, we had a lot of dead Americans. So it kind of makes you wonder, like, oh, you know, what if we recognized that, you know, Mao, like Tito, was somebody who was independent communist, not a tool of Moscow, and actually in many ways opposed to Moscow because he didn't want to be dominated by the Kremlin. Maybe this was somebody we could have actually worked with. But that insight was not, I mean, some folks in the Truman administration thought that they couldn't do anything about it because of this, you know, political storm over who lost China and all the rest of it. So we really let politics drive that China policy for a lot of years, you know, at a very high cost. And so I think, you know, that's another example of the importance of listening to folks who actually understand what's going on the ground, instead of just succumbing to kind of simplistic slogans and thinking that's going to be a good basis to make foreign policy.
Yeah, totally agree.
Jen, one more question from the field?
Yep, we have another question from Lee, if you want to come up and ask it. All right, I will go ahead and read it. So Lee asks, says, there's a book entitled Kiss the Boys Goodbye, which is about service members we left behind in Vietnam. The book says our success rate with the assets we put in to North Vietnam was virtually 0%. Very few of the assets worked out to our benefit. Did Lansdale ever make any claims about how successful we were?
He didn't make claims, but he certainly inserted assets into North Vietnam while the Geneva Accords were, the Geneva Convention was being negotiated, and afterwards there was a, you know, because the Geneva Convention Accords in 1954 obviously split Vietnam into North and South. North dominated by Ho Chi Minh and the communists, the South supposedly part of the free world, but there was a transition period where people could go back and forth, and so Lansdale was kind of working two different lines of operations at that time. One, or more than two, really. One major line of operation was trying to strengthen Diem's authority in South Vietnam, but the other was also trying to undermine Ho Chi Minh and the communist government in North Vietnam, which he did through a variety of methods, including, you know, he spread fanciful propaganda to encourage Catholics in North Vietnam to migrate to South Vietnam to strengthen Diem's regime in the South. And, you know, hundreds of thousands of them actually did that. And he you know, put out, you know, he did leaflet and propaganda campaigns to suggest that North Vietnamese were going to be, you know, drafted to work on Siberian railways and other stuff and all sorts of bad stuff, basically, and, you know, spread tales of the North Vietnamese, you know, crucifying Catholics and so forth, which wasn't actually happening. But anyway, it encouraged people to go to the South. But at the same time, he was also infiltrating assets into North Vietnam with the help of this extraordinary character named Lu Co Minh, sometimes known as Black Luigi, who was this French-American CIA officer, former Army officer, and one of the former paratrooper, and one of the great swashbuckling characters in the history of the CIA. He actually parachuted the team into Hanoi at the end of World War II. He met Ho Chi Minh, and then later in 1954, he and his team infiltrated assets, North Vietnamese refugees back into North Vietnam, and infiltrated weapons and radios and you know, explosives and stuff, basically to create a stay behind network or kind of a resistance network. And, you know, Lou would come in on an airplane and, you know, dump the supplies into the jungle, and then would be picked up by the agents. But anyway, it was a very elaborate, very elaborate thing that went on. That was top secret until it was revealed. The leak, Dan Ellsberg's leak of the Pentagon Papers. And by the way, Dan Ellsberg, who recently died, was a protege of Lansdale. That's another story. But the bottom line is that none of these efforts was really successful. All of all of the agent networks that Blue Koning and Ned Lansdale infiltrated into North Vietnam, they were basically all rolled up pretty quickly by North Vietnamese security forces. Some of them were turned, a lot of them were arrested or executed, and that was very similar to the CIA's experience all over Eastern Europe in the late 40s, early 50s, and in China as well, where they kept infiltrating these agents, and none of them lasted very long, because the reality is it's very hard to create armed resistance networks inside a communist state with a very effective, police state and secret police and all that. They will roll up the network. So this was not a very successful operation for Lansdale, trying to do kind of classic espionage or armed resistance, stay behind networks, all that. He was much more successful with his political influence campaigns in Saigon and Manila.
Okay, Jen, the question field, Jen?
Yep, we've got a question from Dylan. If you want to come up and ask yours. Give it just a second. All right, not hearing anything, so I'll go ahead and read it. So Dylan says, the general lack of understanding and listening to General Lansdale on coin doctrine reminded me of Colonel Mitchell and his ideas about the Air Force, which people realized he was right only after his death. Have you been able to talk to any current military officials or seen something similar to Lansdale where generals have actually recognized Lansdale's ideas on coin?
I think some of that has happened. There was kind of a rebirth of coin doctrine in the middle of the Iraq War, circa 2005, 2006, when we made some of the same mistakes we made in Vietnam, thinking that we could basically shoot our way out of an insurgency. And it was by 2005, 2006, I think it was pretty obvious that was not working. It was actually making the problem worse, which is something, an insight that Lansdale had, in the early 1950s, that if you just round up a bunch of young men indiscriminately, or if you kill a bunch of people, you're going to probably wind up creating more enemies than you eliminate, because you're going to really piss off all of their relatives. And in fact, also a lot of these people who get tossed into prison as suspected insurgents may not be insurgents when they go in, but by the time they come out, they probably are going to be insurgents. So it's kind of a self-defeating strategy. So that was something Lansdale figured out in the early 1950s. It took a while to act on any of that in Vietnam. Of course, it also took a while to act on any of that in Iraq and Afghanistan. But gradually, when the Army and Marine Corps and General Petraeus and General Mattis released their joint coin manual in 2006, I guess it was, I think there was a rediscovery of some of these basic tenets of counterinsurgency that Lansdale had pioneered, many decades earlier, and then it was applied with some degree of success during the surge in Iraq. But now I feel like we're probably going to forget it all again, because for very understandable and natural reasons, we're back on a big world mindset. Makes sense. We're dealing with Russia, we're dealing with China. Those are the most important adversaries that we face, but I think there is still a danger if we forget once again about how to do counterinsurgency, if we forget about how to deal with lower intensity threats, because those threats, they're not going to be going away either if history is an indication.
To kind of piggyback on that question, Max, you go in detail about the Hook insurgency, and the strategy against that was ballots versus bullets, which worked really well. How'd that work for him so successfully in the Philippines, but was even addressed as a plausible strategy for Vietnam? Because it seemed to work very well in the Philippines.
It did work. That strategy of ballots over bullets worked pretty well in the Philippines, primarily because Mac Sai was a genuine Democrat, a small D Democrat. He was somebody who didn't want to be a dictator. He really wanted to be a man of the people and a constitutional president. And one of the most effective things that Lansdale did in the Philippines, although he was kind of secretly helped to manage Mang Sai's 1953 presidential campaign. But the most successful thing that he even helped to create a campaign song for Mang Sai Mike Saisai is my guy, and that was sung all over the Philippines. But so he had a lot of like marketing gimmicks, but fundamentally, the most important thing he did was simply in mobilizing NGOs and civil society organizations in the Philippines to reduce electoral fraud, because electoral fraud was how the Hooks gained legitimacy among the peasants, because up until then, the kind of landowning elites in the Philippines were rigging the elections. And so ordinary peasants, ordinary farmers who had grievances felt like they couldn't get any redress for their grievances from the political system. So the only way to make things right was to pick up a gun and join the Hooks. And so what Lansdale did was he made it much harder for the powerful elite to steal the elections, and mobilized all these election observers and basically created pretty free and fair elections. And so that was what enabled Mike Saisai to win, what legitimated his victory. He tried to do the same thing in Vietnam, but ZM was not a Democrat like Mike Saisai. He really was not interested in genuine democracy. He was kind of interested in basically creating a fascist state, kind of an illiberal pro-American state to oppose the illiberal anti-American state in North Vietnam. And then later in the 1960s, Lansdale tried to get the Johnson administration interested in holding free and fair elections in South Vietnam to legitimate the government, which by that point was a military junta. And the Johnson administration really had very little interest in that, and Westmoreland had very little interest in that. And so it never really became a priority. And so and really, I think that was kind of the Achilles heel of South Vietnam up until the end of South Vietnam in 1965, was the state did not have fundamental legitimacy among its own people. And that was something that's why it collapsed so quickly under the North Vietnamese invasion after US aid was basically cut off. Kind of similar to what happened, very similar to what happened in Afghanistan very recently. Again, same thing, where US cuts off aid to Ashraf Ghani and his government. They basically collapsed with very little resistance, even though on paper they should have been able to hold out for quite a while, but they couldn't, because it was really the Taliban who had greater legitimacy as the nationalist champions of Afghanistan. So too, the same thing happened with the Viet Cong in Vietnam. They had greater nationalist legitimacy than the government we were supporting, and that was something that Lansdale recognized was a problem from the get-go, but we just could not get decision makers in Washington to focus on that as a priority.
Awesome. Jen, another question in the field?
Yep, Mr. David Davis has a question for you. He said he's going to come up on comms. We'll give him just a minute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I feel like the AT&T commercial or whoever it was. First of all, I appreciate this program so much. I'm a child of the Vietnam War. My dad was Air Force. I graduated high school in '65. In the midst of all this, ended up doing Air Force ROTC, ended up flying in Vietnam and Cambodia. So I lived from the very beginning. I was on duty at the command post in Okinawa when the order was made to withdraw from the embassy. So I was there from the very beginning to the very end. Opposed the war, actually marched in the streets in Austin, Texas against the war. But when the time came, I went because my dad was military and I didn't want to embarrass him. I learned subsequent to all of this that in 1972, when President Nixon was running for re-election, that based upon some polling done by CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, it was determined that if he started bombing Hanoi and Haiphong, that the American public would support him and that would help him get reelected in November. I was sent to Vietnam in May and started beginning the war when we went back north to bomb, despite the fact that I always felt like, in many ways, I feel like listening to you that my thoughts about the war were so similar to Lansdale, that we were taking the wrong position, that it was not going to work out, and it was a foolish effort that was going to result in the loss of many lives, including 5 of my very close friends who died over there. Did Lansdale ever discuss, when after the war, the strategic decisions made by Nixon and Kissinger, Laird, and the people making the decisions in Vietnam, Westmoreland, the decisions to bomb North Vietnam, and how that was going to somehow impact the decisions in South Vietnam that would lead to an American victory, in the sense that democracy would result, or was it? Did he ever talk about that? And that's what I'm really curious about, because it was something that weighed on my mind for the entire 63 through 75 time period when I lived through this period. And again, I so appreciate when I read books about Vietnam that brings us information that we weren't aware of at that time. Some of which I'm so glad to know makes me feel better about the decisions I made, but at the same time also makes me feel bad about the decisions that were being made for those of us who lived through it and for those of us who didn't survive it. Again, thank you so much for your book. I look forward to hearing your response.
Well, it was a very eloquent and moving statement. I'm not sure I have a lot to add to that, but to address the question you asked about Lansdale, I mean, yeah, I think he was quite aware of kind of the cynical machinations of the Nixon administration, the Christmas bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong. And I think somebody at the time, I think one of the diplomats in the Nixon administration put something along the lines of, we bombed North Vietnam to get them to accept our concessions, because the bombing didn't really change very much in terms of the outlines of the Paris Peace Accords, but it kind of provided a camouflage for Nixon to say, I'm tough on Vietnam, and basically allow them, and then I'm going to pull all of our troops out and basically, leave South Vietnam. But it allowed them to kind of neutralize any kind of criticism from the right, because he could say, I'm pounding the bejesus out of them, and I'm a tough guy. But basically, the terms of the Paris Peace Accords, I mean, one of the great tragedies is that was probably something that was attainable years earlier. But if Nixon had been willing to pay the political price, but he wouldn't do that basically until after the 1972 election, because he didn't want it to hurt him with his constituency. And I mean, the Paris Peace Accords were very similar in a lot of ways to the accords that South Khalilzad and the Trump administration negotiated with the Taliban. Also very one-sided, the basic point being, we pull our forces out, and then the other side makes a bunch of commitments which they're under no obligation to keep. That's what happened with the Paris Peace Accords, was what happened in Afghanistan. And that's understandable if we're not, because in both of those cases, the other side had a much stronger will to win than we did, and we just didn't have the same level of stakes involved in fighting in those countries that they did. But of course, the tragedy is that it was obvious, from the 1968 offensive on, it was obvious that we were not going to prevail militarily in Vietnam. But we still, I think, lost more Americans after 68 than we lost before, and that was really in a futile struggle that never had much chance of success. And it's truly a tragedy that it was not possible to end the war earlier, because, as I say, the terms of the Paris Peace Accords were probably attainable earlier. But there was a lot of cynical calculations by Nixon and Kissinger, who were caught basically saying that they wanted all they wanted was a short period between the American pullout and the fall of South Vietnam, so that they would not be blamed for it. A decent interval is the way that Kissinger put it.
Okay, Jen, one more from the field, Jen.
Yep, got another one from the field from Mr. Michael Brazelton. If you want to unmute and come up and ask your question.
Okay, let's see. Did Lansdale recognize the fact that Ho Chi Minh had just defeated the French and the country was supposed to have been reunited after countrywide elections? However, South Vietnam declared itself an independent country, counter to the Vietnam agreements. Is it any wonder that nationalist movement was started to reunite the country? Could Lansdale win the hearts and minds of the people under those conditions?
Well, it was very hard, and certainly Lansdale was one of those who was urging President Eisenhower, probably didn't need a lot of urging, not to hold this referendum on that would wind up reunifying the country, because it was a pretty foregone conclusion what the result of that would be, in part because Ho Chi Minh was, the great nationalist hero of Vietnam at that point, having, driven the French out, but also in fairness, because, the Viet Minh had created a police state in North Vietnam, so they weren't going to allow truly fair elections. So that would be, they would control that country with a larger population than South Vietnam. And so they would basically pack the ballot box, and it was a foregone conclusion what would happen. And so Lansdale argued against holding that election, and instead trying to create a viable state of South Vietnam. But again, that was not a controversial position in Washington in the mid-1950s. Pretty much everybody in a position of authority thought that was the way to go. Nobody thought that we could risk a communist takeover of South Vietnam. Although, in hindsight, it's obvious with the benefit of hindsight that the costs of trying to keep the communists out of South Vietnam were much greater than they were worth, and it was ultimately a losing struggle. But I don't think that a lot of people foresaw that with great clarity in the 1950s.
Hey, Jen.
Yep, we've got another one from the field from Mr. Rock Mendenhall. If you want to come up and ask your question.
To piggyback off what the gentleman was saying previous to Mike, did Lansdale ever mention the differences in policy between the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and then potential missteps, especially with the reversal instructions to McNamara following the transition to the Johnson administration? I see in some of his recordings in the JFK library, when JFK was incoming as president, he said that all McNamara wanted to tell Kennedy about was Vietnam. Did he ever mention his thoughts on the politics between the various administrations and their different approaches?
Oh, definitely. I mean, he was in the middle of all that. He was a high-level advisor in the Kennedy administration. He was very much near the center of decision making, and all that. And then, of course, as I mentioned, he was kind of pushed aside after the failure of Operation Mongoose and finally retired right before the coup that overthrew Diem, and that he had warned against. And then, of course, he was very much on the outs with Johnson. He was actually championed by Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, was a fan of Lansdale, but Humphrey got very little sway with Johnson when it came to running the war in Vietnam. And so, yeah, I mean, that was, Lansdale had a pretty consistent message of, if we were going to help Vietnam, we need to do it with military aid, we need to do it with a limited number of advisors, but we certainly should not be sending huge numbers of American ground combat troops. But that was the decision that the Johnson administration made. And by the time they made that, Lansdale was out of government, and again had very little sway with anybody except Hubert Humphrey. But Johnson didn't really listen to Humphrey when it came to Vietnam. Of course, Johnson was part of Johnson's decision making was he was very haunted by the debate over who lost China, because he saw how that occurred. Truman and the Democrats, and led to the election of a Republican in 1952. And so he was paranoid about not being blamed for losing Vietnam. So he was going to do whatever it took to avoid that from happening. And he certainly did not go about it in a very smart or effective manner. And again, Lansdale was warning against that, but he was really out in the wilderness at that point, not being listened to. And it was only when Johnson started, having some doubts about his policy or seeing greater opposition to it, that he agreed to send Lansdale out to Vietnam. But nobody ever really gave Lansdale any power or authority. So there was very little he could do to affect the war. I mean, it was really, at that point, it was in the hands of General William Westmoreland, who was, a very conventional World War II style general who thought, that the way to win was to kill more of the enemy than they could put out in the field. And Lansdale kept warning that was not going to work because North Vietnam had control of a large population base. But Westmoreland just was not listening to folks like Lansdale.
Max, the last question will be for me because it's 8 o'clock now. We promised you to be out by 8. So last question is, seems to me that he took the very much a whole nation approach before he's even caught a whole nation approach, both in the Philippines and Vietnam. Looking at that kind of perspective, what should we as today's airmen take away from Edward Lansdale's career and strategies on COIN as we look at, today's constant crisis with small countries like this, or with less than global power, great power competition countries, but almost the kind of GWAT environment we're in for the last 20 years. What can we learn from Lansdale to transition to kind of being our best in those kind of conflicts in the future?
Well, I think that the big takeaway from Lansdale is that the kind of big war, firepower intensive, technologically focused mindset is not the right one for a counterinsurgency type situation, for dealing with failing states that are facing uprisings, and there's plenty of states like that right now, many of them in Africa, Somalia and Mali and so many others that we're still dealing with. And kind of the Lansdale approach is to send a small team of advisors who really get immersed in that society and can win the confidence of local leaders and to work with them effectively to craft strategies to improve governance and to cut down on the abuses of security forces and to try to win over the confidence of the people. And that's not something that can be done quickly or easily. It requires a long-term commitment. It requires folks who have a lot of staying power, a lot of local country knowledge. And those are things that are very hard to do in our bureaucracy. And that's, but as a percentage of our overall armed forces and our defense budget, it's a tiny percentage, right? Because most of what we need to do is still very conventional. Obviously, for the Air Force, it's thinking about the China threats, thinking about the Russia threat, very conventional threats where these precepts don't really apply very much. Although to some extent, they still do in places like Indonesia, where you're still dealing with countries that are very important, but very ambivalent. They don't want to get on the wrong side of either China or the United States. So you still need people who can work very effectively with local leaders to try to persuade them to work more with us rather than with China, for example. That's still something that's very important in so many countries in Asia, aside from our handful of very close allies who are going to be on our side no matter what. So there's still some of those skill sets that I think are very, very important, but they rise into even greater importance, I think, in unconventional situation where you're dealing with insurgents or rebels of various kinds. And so I think a lot of that really just comes down to understanding the political environment and how to operate in it. And that's kind of very antithetical to folks who are kind of very rigid and narrow in their military mindset and just think about, putting warheads on foreheads. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of value in doing that. But there are also a lot of complicated political questions that will ultimately determine the course of these conflicts that don't have an obvious engineering solution that require leaders who can understand the nuances and complexities of foreign societies. And I think that's especially true as you get higher up the food chain. I mean, when we're talking about like combat and commanders, I mean, probably like 80% of what they do is really politics and diplomacy, dealing with foreign societies and trying to, foreign militaries and foreign governments trying to win their confidence. So, I think that there's obviously a lot of need for conventional war knowledge and weapon systems and all that. And obviously that's going to be the bulk of what the military does. But I think there also has to be an understanding of politics, international relations, diplomacy, marketing, all these other skills, and how you actually deal with people and win them over, because that's actually how a lot of conflicts will get solved in the end.
Awesome, Max. Max, so it's a great session. Thanks for talking to us tonight. Appreciate you taking your time from your busy schedule to do that. Please meet us in the green room afterwards on video. And everybody else, next month's going to be, July is going to be, August is going to be Barriers Upside Down about the Misty pilots in Vietnam. And I'll be a Don Shepard and Rick Newman book. get you the date and time on that once I get with the authors. Again, thanks for a great session. Max, it's great to meet you and talk with you. And thanks for bringing it to life. The most unknown intel officer in Air Force history is probably the most successful one. And the guy who coined counterinsurgency. So as an intel officer, this book meant a lot to me, sir. And also a UCLA guy meant a lot to me too. So thank you for your time.
Go Bruins. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
Max, thanks for your insight and summary in Sunday's Post article. It was very insightful.
Oh, thank you very much. Really
Very great.
appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Thank you.
And for all the Air Force folks, by the way, I want to remind you, yesterday was the 100th anniversary of air refueling from 1923 to today. We can't get it done without it.
Pass gas.